Dead faces in the water. Dead faces everywhere. Chapter 14. Rivendell. Summary. Wise counsel and the unraveling of hard words. Narrator's note. Well, folks, this is quite a long chapter, and I'm planning to break it up into multiple parts so that I can upload it without it taking absolutely hours to do. Anyways, hope you enjoy the long chapter. I certainly did. Boromir realizes that he is drumming his fingers on the table and snatches them back hurriedly. He folds his hand into his pocket in an attempt to control himself. There is no brother here to kick him in the ankle or shoot him a warning text when his fidgets get out of hand. He will have to manage them himself, rather than relying on Faramir to watch and pull Boromir's straying thoughts back on topic before his inattention causes some offense. He glances around furtively, looking for scowling brows or pursed lips turned his way, but if anyone has noticed his slip in decorum, they are keeping their censure to themselves, at least. The conference room is not crowded for its size, but it feels as though it is to him. Too many of the beings in it seem to have more presence than these high-windowed walls were meant to contain. Glorfindel, of course, is the greatest. Being in an enclosed space with him is like being in a room with the sun itself, and Boromir has taken care to angle his chair so that the too tall, too golden elf is out of his direct line of sight. It is the only way he can keep from squinting. The elf who stands at the head of the conference table, although he is not an elf, Boromir remembers, even if he looks like one. Not an elf, but indistinguishable from an elf, at least to Boromir's human eyes. Very well, then. The half-elf who stands at the head of the conference table is not as harsh upon the eyes as gleaming Glorfindel, but he is difficult to look at straight on nonetheless. There is weight in his gray eyes that makes Boromir feel small. It is something like looking into his father's eyes sometimes when Denethor is deep in thought. His mighty mind turned to things far beyond Boromir's more everyday purview, but 100 times more so. Even standing next to the imposing glow of Glorfindel, Elrond has a presence that cannot be overshadowed or ignored. Much of what we have come to discuss today will be familiar to many of you, for it is by your efforts that we have come to know anything of the danger we now face. Yet few here have heard all of it, for it is only in recent days that we have begun to piece together the knowledge thus gleaned into one whole. Those of you who have heard much of this before will excuse me for going over all of it in detail again, I hope. Elrond is saying in his voice that is at once as strong as summer sunlight and as soothing as a cool spring rain. It is imperative that everyone be on the same page if we are to proceed productively in this discussion, and some of those in attendance here are newly come. Boromir knows that Elrond is speaking of him only in this chair for 15 minutes. He does not know who else is a new addition to whatever meeting this is that Glorfindel has bundled him into, save for Glorfindel himself, of course, who arrived with Boromir. Yet he suspects that Glorfindel is as knowledgeable about whatever topic they are here to discuss as is Elrond himself, and needs no recap to remind him of anything he might have missed while he was ferrying Boromir from the university to the hospital. He looks around, weighing the others. Most of the elves he dismisses as staff either here or from the university. The white robes of the doctors are plain enough even without the emblem of Imladris Hospital embroidered on their shoulders. Some even have masks still dangling from their necks, as though they have only just walked out of some sick room. Boromir's skin crawls at the sight, and he wonders not for the first time why a conversation happening in a hospital should be relevant to Gondor's concerns about the dead marshes. As for the scholars, well, Boromir has Faramir for a brother. He knows how to recognize a scholar. There is one elf who stands out as distinct enough from the rest to be worth studying. He is not sitting in his chair, but rather perched upon it with his knees up around his ears. He is dressed in green and brown, but his clothes are strange. Boromir cannot decide if he is wearing leggings or capris, but whatever they are, the cloth is thin and ends well above his ankles in a way that looks far too casual for this elegant conference room. Far too casual and far too young for someone invited to any discussion of import. Over those, he wears some sort of loose, hooded, sleeveless tunic whose folds are soft enough that the fabric reminds Boromir of nothing so much as moss. The pale sleeves of whatever shirt he has on beneath that are pushed up nearly to the elbow, revealing skinny brown arms and a leather wrist cuff. His hair, golden, but without the eye-smarting gleam of Glorfindel's sunburnt locks, is half restrained in thin braids and half dangling loose over his shoulders. It hangs lower than the seat of his chair, and shivers slightly every time Boromir looks at it, even though there is no wind in this room. The elf's pale eyes dart around the conference table like a nervous animal, or perhaps like a hunter seeking prey. He is strange in a much more grounded way than Glorfindel is strange. Strange in a way that speaks of old stories about dark forests and danger. And something about his still face and skittering eyes makes Boromir feel anxious in his own skin. He catches himself drumming on the table again, and yanks his hand away with a grimace. He turns his gaze to the being sitting between himself and the green-clad elf. One of 4 dwarves at the table, and the only one who does not seem to belong to either the hospital or the university. The tall wooden chairs in this room, Boromir has noticed, vary in height despite sharing identical carvings and designs. All of them, furthermore, have folding steps that tuck beneath their legs, which confused him at first until he saw the dwarves. Now he realizes that the steps are there for their benefit, both to make it easier for them to climb into seats that are too tall for their stature, and to serve as footrests for them once they are there, rather than leaving their feet to dangle over empty air. It is a clever design. He notes distantly that it is something Gondor should adopt, although he is preoccupied enough by more important concerns right now that he does not have any illusions that he will remember the ingenuity of these multi-being chairs later. This dwarf's coppery beard sports the sort of thick, intricate braids that Boromir is used to seeing on dwarven faces, each one secured with carved stone beads, and the rest of his hair is pulled back from his pink cheeks in a single loose ponytail. There are shadows under his eyes, and his ruddy skin is waxy and pale in a way that speaks to some recent illness, or perhaps to something else. Boromir is not an expert on dwarven well-being. Whatever his state of health, He is dressed in a plain red hoodie and jeans over heavy boots, and the normalcy of his garb immediately soothes some of the nervous energy that the green elf's strangeness has set buzzing in Boromir's veins. He looks like any dwarf whom Boromir might have passed on an ordinary day upon the streets of Minas Tirith, and the quasi-familiarity of his unknown but everyday appearance is a comfort in the face of so much strangeness and uncertainty. Boromir even smiles at him, although the dwarf is looking at Elrond, and so he does not see. The other humans who sit around the conference table offer no such comfort. They all wear the dignified, if occasionally rumpled, robes of Imladris doctors or scholars, and their faces are alternately grim or worn down into gray exhaustion. They make him feel as though he stands on the brink of some disaster, although he does not know why. Boromir realizes belatedly that Elrond is still speaking, and that once again his attention has strayed at an inopportune moment. He laces his fingers together tightly and forces himself to focus on the Perethel's words. "Can see from this chart," Elrond says, one thin and graceful hand curving to indicate the printouts and drawings that fill the wall and whiteboards behind him. Boromir has done his best to ignore those charts, with their blood and bones and little black splotches that look like nothing so much as armies marching across a distant plain. "The progress of this infection is irregular," Elrond continues, "but it does not falter. Once the disease has established itself in a body, it continues to progress without fail. Except," he adds with a thoughtful frown, "for 3 cases. The first is that of a dwarf, who was exposed to infected fluids, but succeeded in fighting off the disease before it could gain a foothold. Indeed, our analysis of his blood shows no definitive occurrence of the virus. Perhaps some natural mutation has provided him with an immunity, or it may be environmental. Unlike our other patients, he is not a resident of Rivendell. We have Nastandir looking into the possibilities. If you will take a look at his chart here, you can see how his immune system responded to the exposure." Both the dwarf sitting beside Boromir and the strange elf beside him make strange, abortive gestures that draw Boromir's eyes away from Elrond. The dwarf tugs on one of his heavy pleats, then hunches low in his seat, arms folded across his beard. The elf wraps his hands around the thin braids dangling past his ears, and holds on like one might clutch a rope while drowning. His eyes dart sideways for a moment, before fixing forward again. The dwarf does not look up at all. Boromir eyes them curiously for a moment, before he remembers what he is supposed to be doing and drags his focus back to Elrond. "Others are 2 members of our staff who were infected during the course of their duties here," Elrond is saying. He points to a new set of charts, which show at first an increasing and then decreasing number of black splotches moving across the display readout. "We do not yet know if the fact that their infection vector was presumably different from those of the initial patients is responsible for this. Whether it is because they received prompt treatment immediately following exposure, or if it is simply due to their elvish nature. None of the initial patients were elvish," Elrond tells them all, "although we do not know if that is due to natural elvish resistance or mere happenstance of exposure. We as of yet have fewer than 40 patients after all. While statistically some of them ought to be elves, given the makeup of the valley's population, we do not yet have a large enough sample size to reliably theorize accurately one way or the other. How were they exposed? Your people, I mean? The elves? It is the green elf who speaks, and his voice is as strange as the rest of him. His Westorn is oddly accented and lilting, and he forms the words with care, as though they do not come naturally to his lips. They were bit 2 days ago, says one of the elvish doctors, by patients whose symptoms have proceeded to the delirious and violent stages. Her smooth face twists in a grimace that makes her look, for a moment, almost human. We have begun employing restraints for the more advanced cases since. Were any other healers bit? The green elf asks. He is sitting forward suddenly on the balls of his feet, his knees dropping as though he is on the brink of leaping from his seat, and his eyes are wide and keen as the blade of a knife. Or only elvish ones? Only those 2 elves, the doctor replies. Why? The green elf sits back with a relieved sigh. Elves can recover from a bite, he says. Even a few bites, although too many at a time, and... He shakes his head. A cloud seems to pass over his face, heavy and troubled. Even elvish resistance can be overwhelmed, he explains quietly. But a single bite is not enough to hurt us. Not much. Elrond raises an eyebrow. They both displayed the initial symptoms of the infection, he says. His voice is so mild that it makes Boromir hunch his shoulders in anticipation of a lecture. The green elf frowns. What symptoms? He asks. Fever, the doctor who spoke before replies. Dry mouth, headaches, although they have manifested none of the other usual signs so far, and their viral loads have both dropped low enough that we can no longer detect the infection in their blood. Their fevers, the doctor begins, but she is interrupted by a sudden exclamation from the dwarf in the red hoodie. You can detect this illness? How? He asks. Our healers could devise no means by which to test for it, save by watching for its symptoms. It is difficult to detect, the doctor admits. We can only do so by separating out the blood into its component parts with a centrifuge, then analyze the white blood cells for traces of contamination using extremely sensitive ethyllium microscopes. Here, she says, rummaging through the papers in front of her and then sliding a few of them down the table toward the dwarf. I admit the technology itself is not my area of expertise. Perhaps you will find the reports on the progress more illuminating than my words. Thank you, the dwarf murmurs, and buries himself in the documents. Boromir, peering over his shoulder, sees a lot of highly technical jargon he cannot parse and some very intricate diagrams. He looks away again with a grimace. As I was saying, the elven doctor continues, the fever of our 2 elvish patients have likewise passed, although we are keeping them both in isolation and under close observation for the moment in case they experience a relapse. The dwarf in the hoodie stirs again, but does not speak. They will not, the green elf says dismissively. Elves may feel sick from a bite for a little, but we get better. Do you have proof that supports that assertion? Asks one of the dwarven doctors. The green elf reaches up to his collar and drags it roughly down and sideways, exposing a narrow shoulder and swooping collarbone. Boromir is only 2 seats away, and so he can clearly see the pale marks upon that brown skin. Marks that look disturbingly like they were left there by a human, or someone of human-like shape anyways. It could have been an elf. Boromir does not know how to spot the difference, if there are any, between an elf and a human bite radius, trying to tear the green elf's trapezius with their teeth. Many of my people have suffered bite wounds in our fight against the dead, the green elf explains calmly. The wounds take longer to heal than injuries usually do, as you can see, but only those with multiple bites have succumbed. Oh, the dwarven doctor says. It is a strangled sound. He sits back with a thump and swallows hard, his eyes fixed on the pale scars until the green elf hides them behind his clothes again. I see. The dwarf clears his throat and looks to Elrond. It is admittedly not much of a sample size, but it does match with what we have observed. Elrond agrees. And I think that we shall have to take young Legolas's words as the only facts that we are likely to see come out of Mirkwood for some time. There is a general murmur of agreement, and Boromir hears someone mutter a disparaging comment about Gondor's lack of diligence in repairing the Palantir network, but he cannot take offense at such slander right now. He is too busy digesting the rest of the words he just heard spoken. Wait, he says, leaning forward so that he can lock eyes with the green elf, Legolas, his own eyes wide with shock and horror. Wait, you said the dead. Your fight is against the dead? What dead? It is Glorfindel who answers him. You see now why you were brought to this meeting, Boromir, steward's son. It is far too likely that our concerns converge with your own. But I do not understand, Boromir says, looking around the room in hopes of finding some explanation that will cause all of this to make sense. How can anyone be fighting with the dead? What does this have to do with the bodies vanishing from the dead marshes? How— The bodies of the dead marshes have vanished? Interrupts a human scholar. How? They have been there for 3,000 years, unchanged by time or upheaval. They are there no longer, Boromir tells her. But I don't understand what this has to do with— He waves a hand around in the vague direction of the charts on the wall and the length of the conference table. With any of this? I believe I may, Legolas says. Orifer was the first of the dead we saw walking between our trees. His voice is low, and his eyes are dark with shadowed pain. Orifer, Elrond says, and for a moment the facade of his calm slips, and Boromir can see it for the mask it is. But Orifer died in the first major battle in Mordor of the last alliance, yes, Legolas says. His eyes flick toward Boromir. He, along with the rest of our people slain in that charge, were buried on the grounds that later became the Dead Marshes. Boromir becomes aware that there are many eyes upon him now. Indeed, Elrond alone, who is still staring at Legolas, a stricken look upon his face, has not turned to face him yet. And Boromir feels himself quell beneath such intense regard. Perhaps it would be a good idea for you to explain your part of things, Captain Stewartson, says a dark-skinned elvish scholar who has so many thin braids twisted atop her head that she almost seems to be wearing a crown. Tell us all what oddity has brought you to Rivendell. Boromir swallows and nods. He squares his shoulders and stands to deliver his report, as though he were back in Minas Tirith, speaking to his commanding officers or his father's council. On May 13th, one of our regular scouting patrols of the borderlands of Mordor reported a strange phenomenon. All of the dead... He breaks off to pause and frown at the room. Is everyone here familiar with the general facts of the Dead Marshes? He asks, realizing that he is not in Gondor any longer and cannot assume that these people know even the most basic details of his homeland. They are a noxious wetland northwest of Dagorland, Glorfindel says, before anyone else can speak. The bulk of the dead lying there were elves of Mirkwood and Lothlorien, who died during the last alliance, and the orcs who died fighting them, although a skirmish between Gondor and the Wainriders later added many bodies of human warriors to this charnel land. That skirmish was when King Andorhur of Gondor died, Boromir interjects, miffed at the Golden Elf's disregard for the event's import. Glorfindel acknowledges his point with an absent nod and continues. Over time, the marshes spread across the burial ground, and the once-lost dead were revealed laying in the brackish pools seemingly untouched by time. But this was an illusion, an echo only. There were no bodies, only the memory of their deaths forever trapped within the rotting waters of the marshes. They are trapped no longer, Boromir announces heavily. The dead were gone when the scouts crossed the marshes. All of them. Impossible, declares another elf, a dark-haired one in university robes. Not impossible, Legolas says quietly. We have seen them in Mirkwood, or many of them, at least, our own dead, and some who once fought for Lorien. He frowns thoughtful. We saw no ancient human dead, however. Perhaps they went somewhere else. Or perhaps they truly did rot to nothing, suggests a human doctor. Elvish bodies do not decay as quickly as those of mortals. Perhaps some feature of the necromancer's old work preserved those elvish corpses lying so close to his lands as they were. Impossible, the university elf says again. There are numerous reports on the Dead Marshes, and many expeditions were sent to investigate them over the centuries, even a few in early years which attempted to recover bodies. There were no corpses found in those fetid waters, only fell illusions. Flesh or illusion, they are not there now, insists Boromir. For a moment there is silence. Then Elrond asks, Legolas, how certain are you that the figures that you saw in Mirkwood, how certain are you that they are indeed those long-dead kin? Certain, the green elf says, his voice a low rasp. He is hunched down in his chair now, head ducked low between his spindly legs. His eyes glitter like some fey forest creature as he stares up at them from the shadows of his hair, and Boromir shivers and lowers himself back into his seat as though it somehow might protect him from that fey elvish gleam. Their bodies and garments were bleached of much color, and their eyes were empty, Legolas explains with a flinch. But their faces were all but unchanged, almost unrotted. Those who knew them when they rode away to war knew them again at once. My own father saw Orithor, one of his fathers, and knew him. My mother, too, saw her mother, Giltharawen, who had died at the side of her king in that ruinous charge. All of them were known to someone, even the elves of Lorien, for in those days our people mingled more than they do now, I am told. It was a happy reunion, we thought, when we saw them. He breathes, his voice catching on the words. For a moment. A spasm of pain passes across the elf's thin face, and he falls into a heavy silence. Glorfindel exchanges a dark look with the university elf. Orithor was a somewhat distinctive personage, the latter murmurs. I doubt that anyone in Mirkwood, least of all Thranduil himself, would be mistaken as to his identity, even after so many years. He was rather unforgettable. Glorfindel nods as both their eyes flick sideways to land on Legolas, who sits curled in on himself atop his seat, one hand anxiously coiling a thin gold braid over and over through his fingers. Elrond clears his throat, drawing all eyes, Boromir's included, back to him. I fear that we have little choice but to accept that the dead are gone from the marshes, and that they have returned somehow to Mirkwood. But what does that have anything to do with this illness? The dwarf with the red hoodie suddenly bursts out. There is plague here, and plague in Erebor. What does it matter if the dead are wandering around, when there are living who need tending to? Tell him the rest, Legolas, Glorfindel says. His gleaming eyes are dark and hooded. Legolas looks up slowly. The dead are not themselves, he whispers. They are hungry. They walk through the shadows of our trees with no other thought in their heads but to feed. A dwarven doctor frowns. Feed on what? He asks. Us. A long, terrible silence follows the quiet word. We have fought them as best we can, Legolas continues eventually. We thought it might be some fell enchantment of Dol Guldur making us believe that our beloved dead had returned only to harm us. But it is no spell, no illusion. It is them, our own long-lost kith and kin, and whatever caused their return to our woods. We fear they will not stay there. I was sent to bring warning of these walking dead to Rivendell, while others carried the news elsewhere. Not to Erebor, I'll note, the dwarf in the red hoodie grumbles. To Erebor, yes, of course to Erebor, so close to the borders of our trees, Legolas argues. My friend Ladinion was to carry word first to Dell, and then to your lonely mountain. We sent runners to Lothlorien and Minas Tirith as well. No such word had come to Gondor when I left, Boromir says. Messengers were sent, Legolas insists. Either you left before they arrived, or they met with some mischance along the way. He looks around the table, as though seeking for some comfort or confirmation that he speaks the truth. We sent messengers. With the Palantir relay down, there was no other way to send word out from our woods. We knew that the return of the dead was too great a threat to leave unshared. I did not want to leave my people to face this danger without me, Legolas says, his light voice cracking for a moment in pain too bleak for such fair tones. But we knew the rest of Middle-earth had to be warned. That is why I'm here. And we are grateful for your efforts in bringing this news to us, Legolas, Elrond says soothingly. You are right. This is a thing that must be known. To that end, allow me to lay these facts out for everyone, if you please, so that we can all make sure that we have all that we know so far arranged rightly in our minds. The dark-haired university elf says. He scribbles on a folder in front of him as he speaks. The echoes of the bodies that were once in the dead marshes are there no longer. They, the elves among them, at least, we do not yet know the disposition of the mortals that lay decaying alongside them. We will set that issue aside for later. These dead elves have somehow left the marshes in bodies that should have long ago rotted to nothing, walked across many miles, and returned home to Mirkwood's trees. There they have been, well, attacking the living elves who reside there, friends and family alike. Is this correct so far? Legolas nods. The other elf continues. Somehow, these risen corpses appear to be vectors for transferring the same illness that we have been recently affected with here in Rivendell, and in Erebor as well. He acknowledges quickly when the red-clad dwarf stirs, as though to speak. This illness causes fever, nosebleeds, and violent disorientation, and we as of yet have no cure for it, nor any direct vector or connection by which we can link the illness here or in Erebor to the sudden return of Mirkwood's dead. Is that correct? Legolas is frowning at him. Wait, he says. Wait, do you not know what it does yet? This infection? The university elf raises his eyebrows at him expectantly. What do you mean, what it does? Those who are bitten, Legolas says slowly, and do not recover, as elves sometimes do, they die. And then they rise again, dead yet walking, dead as the dead things that bit them, ravenous and empty, hollow shells of bodies with no trace of the souls that once filled them, their sole purpose to feed on the flesh of those who yet live, and thus spread their dreadful affliction further. But they can recover, the red-clad dwarf rasps. He points an accusing finger at the elf beside him. You said you have the scars yourself to prove it. This illness, this death, it can be recovered from, yes? Yes, Legolas says, at least for elves, sometimes. And you are so sure that dwarves cannot do the same? Something in the dwarf's eyes flashes, hot and angry. Legolas looks away.
I do not know how resistant dwarves may be to the infection when they are exposed, he says softly. But I do know that once someone succumbs to it, they are dead, Gimli. There is no recovering from that. I am sorry.
You do not know, though, the dwarf, Gimli, insists. Legolas looks up, and with Gimli sitting between them, Boromir has a clear view of the agony in the elf's pale eyes as he fixes his gaze upon the dwarf.
I do,
he says. The bleakness in his voice makes Boromir shiver, as though someone has poured frozen water down his back.
I am sorry.
Gimli shakes his head, but says nothing. How do we ensure our patients recover instead of succumbing to the disease? One of the human doctors asks. That is the question that matters most right now. Treatment. Everything else must be secondary to that. Legolas, what do your people do when someone is bit? How do they tend the wound? How do they stave off the disease?
Legolas looks confused. We treat it as we would any other wound, he says. We clean it, if we can, and bandage it, and then...
He shrugs.
And then we wait for it to heal. It takes longer than other wounds. This here is almost a month old, he says, pointing to his shoulder. And you can still see the marks. But this one was a week older and not as deep, and it is almost gone.
He extends his arm and indicates the bare brown flesh of his wrist. When Boromir leans forward, squinting, he can just make out a semicircle of pale marks that might have been made by teeth once.
But they do heal, if you do not have too many.
But what do you do to prevent the infection? The doctor asks again, her voice insistent. How do you stop the disease from taking root?
Legolas shrugs again. We try not to be bitten more than once or twice at a time, he says.
The doctor looks frustrated. Boromir cannot blame her. I believe what Asarta Istirin is asking, Legolas, Elrond says gently, is what special treatment your people have developed to stop the disease that the bite causes. Some poultice or salve, perhaps? Even a song, perhaps, that is sung to strengthen the body against the infection, or to drive it out before it can gain a foothold? The great Nithando looks pained at having to refer to such archaic practices, but then Mirkwood is known for being a reclusive and backward place. Perhaps they do still rely wholly on such primitive treatments. Boromir is not the only one who grimaces at the thought of resorting to songs to heal this sickness, but Legolas is already shaking his head.
Nothing, he says. There is nothing that helps. Not that we have found, at least. We burn the dead, he offers, clearly trying to be helpful. Once we have slain them for a second time, this seems to contain the infection, at least, so that it does not poison the land and waters around them.
This affliction is also transmissible through water and soil? One of the dwarven scholars asks sharply. He exchanges a grim glance with his neighbor. I think I have a theory as to how Erebor became infected.
although it does not explain how the illness has reached our valley, too."
The elf beside him nods thoughtfully. "The forest river, you think? It flows into the river running, from which the lonely mountain draws much of its drinking water, depending on the level of viral load and the dilution it was subjected to when the waters merged."
"Are you saying that the elves of Mirkwood are responsible for my people falling sick?"
Gimli asks, his voice a growl. Boromir finds himself leaning back in his chair, as though seeking to put greater distance between himself and the simmering dwarf, although he knows that those scant few inches will make little difference should Gimli's temper boil over.
"They are saying," Elrond answers calmly, "that this disease is not one whose spread can be contained by borders or quarantines, Gimli Bornul. If it is already in the water—"
The whole room goes silent. Boromir feels his stomach twist, and he swallows hard against a sudden, icy nausea. No, it can't already be too late.
"But no one would drink water contaminated by the dead,"
Legolas protests.
"You can't. Even if you tried, your body would purge it instantly."
He grimaces.
"I assure you, you would barely have time to swallow before you are gripped by a sudden, irresistible retching. The disease might be in the water, but it cannot spread that way."
He shakes his head, flaxen braids fluttering.
"It cannot."
"Then how did it reach Erebor?"
the dwarven scholar asks. His eyes, as he looks at Legolas, are cold, but his beard is not yet quivering with rage. Boromir draws a breath and lets his chair slide forward again.
"The same way it reached Mirkwood, I assume,"
Legolas says. He turns to look at Gimli in the seat beside him.
"There were dwarves who fought in the last alliance. Perhaps some of them lay in the dead marshes too," he suggests. "Did any of your dead come home in the days before your sickness spread?"
Gimli looks startled, and Boromir cannot blame him. The only reason he himself knows there were dwarves in the armies of the last alliance is because his little brother is a history nerd who spent his childhood delighting in reading dusty old books and sharing the obscure facts found there with anyone who would listen, which, more often than not, was Boromir. Most of the world has forgotten there were ever dwarves involved in that ancient war in favor of retelling the more exciting tales of Elendil and Gil-galad, and of course Isildur, who together brought about Sauron's fall.
"No,"
Gimli says at last, his low voice thick with some emotion that Boromir cannot identify. He clears his throat, then arches a brow.
"No,"
he repeats drily.
"We would have noticed that."
Based on the timeline that Erebor's doctors documented, the dark-skinned elf from Imladris University says, and what Legolas could tell me of the progression of the disease among the Bjornings.
"The Bjornings?"
Boromir interrupts, unable to stop himself.
"You mean those
He swallows, and glances sideways at Legolas, and changes what he was about to say.
Those commune dwellers who live in in Mirkwood's depths?" From the cool look Elrond gives him, and the way Glorfindel hides his mouth behind his hand, Boromir thinks that his attempt at diplomatic language was a failure. He can feel his face burning, and is careful not to look at Legolas. "Yes," one of the humans from the university drawls. "Those Bjarnings, steward's son, they are the only humans who live in Mirkwood Forest, so they are an important data point if we are to understand how the illness affects different species."
"There are no humans living in Mirkwood," Legolas interrupts abruptly. "Not anymore."
Boromir forgets his embarrassment to gape at the elf. "What?"
"The Bjarnings are dead," Legolas says, his lithe voice very flat. "All of them. Those who did not die and rise again were eaten. Some of their dead still walk among our trees, or at least they did when I left my forest. But there are no humans in Mirkwood now who live."
A frantic susurration fills the room as many voices speak at once, all of them hushed by horror. Boromir cannot make out the words through the ringing in his own ears. He sinks back into his chair and rubs his hands across his face. The Bjarnings have been a joke for as long as Boromir can remember. Those cultish forest hippies determined to live as far off the grid as it is possible for people to go, even if that means squatting in the murder forest among the giant spiders and the skeleton deer and the weird bumpkin elves. He never spent much thought on them at all, save to roll his eyes at the occasional rude meme, or laugh at the jokes his fellow soldiers told about those ridiculous tree-humping yokels. None of it seems very funny now. "As I was saying," the university elf says sharply, raising his voice to be heard over the murmuring, "based on what we know of the timeline of the disease progression in both Erebor and among the late Bjarnings, I posit that the Lonely Mountains were indeed infected by the water, or some other slow-acting source, rather than through direct transmission." Slowly, the room around him falls silent. The elf gestures impatiently at his folder of notes. "May I continue?" Elrond nods. "Please go ahead, Pingoloth Erestor. We are all listening now." "Based on what documentation of the process we have, infection via direct transmission, which is to say, bites from an infected carrier, seems to cause a faster affliction than what we have so far seen in our own patients, none of whom have shown bite wounds." "We have not checked for such wounds, though," one of the human doctors objects. Erestor raises a scathing eyebrow. "Would you not have noticed such wounds when you were examining your patients?" "Almost undoubtedly," the doctor replies, apparently unruffled by Erestor's censure. Boromir is impressed with his pluck. "However, I cannot offer you guarantees on that matter, nor on whether or not such wounds would have been documented and included in the reports you have, since we were not aware of their potential import. It is likely, but not certain." Erestor's eyebrow does not lower. "Duly noted," he says. "Regardless,
Based on Gimli's reports, the spread of the disease in the Lonely Mountains matches that of our dwarven patients here. As none of our patients were likely bitten, I suggest that this indicates that the incidence of disease both here and in Erebor stems from contamination rather than direct infection. Most likely via the river in Erebor's case, as suggested earlier.
Perhaps non-elves are not as sensitive to the contagion?
Suggests a younger human doctor. Istirin, Boromir remembers Elrond calling her. Perhaps humans, and dwarves as well, can ingest contaminated water without being struck by the instinctive urge to purge themselves of the offending substance. Elves often evince a greater sensitivity to certain types of impurities and pollutions than the rest of us do.
That is true, Elrond nods. And if this affliction involves some taint of Mordor, as is possible given the involvement of the corpses from the dead marshes, then it is even more likely.
But how would that taint reach all the way to Rivendell? Another doctor protests.
Could one or more of the dead have escaped Mirkwood's borders and crossed the mountains?
An elf scholar suggests. Following Legolas, perhaps? The first patient predates Legolas's arrival in the valley by almost 3 weeks, argues another.
I was not followed,
Legolas says. His voice is very low and very certain.
Some of the dead may have walked out of our trees already, and some may never have come to Mirkwood at all when they rose from the dead marshes. But I was not followed.
A Sylvan would know, Glorfindel mutters.
Whatever that means, he does not explain, but he seems confident, and several other elves nod or grimace in agreement, so Boromir does not ask for details. They do not seem relevant right now. So, Eristor says crisply, we have evidence of the disease spreading without the direct participation of the ambulatory dead in both Erebor and here in Rivendell, and at least circumstantial evidence that its taint can be detected in water. He gestures to Legolas, even if no direct proof that it is infectious that way. I suggest that prudence recommends that we treat it as potentially waterborne until and unless proven otherwise. The suggestion is met with grim nods. Boromir cannot help picturing a map of Middle-earth in his mind, and shuddering to think of how close the Anduin River flows to Mirkwood's trees before it crosses into his own land. Could this disease be even now making its way south to his people's home? Could it be seeping out of the fetid pools of the dead marshes, and to the Nindalf, and then into the Anduin and North Ithilien?
We do know of one dwarf who was bitten,
Glorfindel points out. He glances apologetically at Gimli.
Glóin had such a wound on his arm when his body was examined. A shallow bite wound festering beneath a bandage.
Do you know, Istirin asks Gimli, when your father was bitten? Did you encounter a member of the affliction on your journey?
Bit? Gimli repeats numbly. No one. We saw no one.
I know this is difficult, Istirin says, her voice gentle. But the more we know about the progression of this disease, the more we will be able to fight it. Try and remember.
Bit, Gimli frowns. Kili, my cousin Kili. He was sick with the fever when we left. He was delirious, chained to his bed. A lot of them were, by that point. Gimli shakes his head, his beard quivering with misery. Only thing to be done to keep them from going after the doctors or anyone else who came close. Kili. The dwarf's ruddy face blanches, turning a sickly white above the vibrant copper of his beard. He bit Da. When Da went to say goodbye, we didn't know. We thought it was just a bite.
Your father was bitten before you left Erebor?
Legolas asks, leaning forward suddenly.
How long did your journey take?
I don't know, Gimli says. He looks like he is in shock. What day is it? He lets out a shaky laugh and says, before anyone can answer his question, it doesn't matter. It can't have been more than a week. A little less, maybe. We drove straight through, much as we could, trying to get here before... His voice falters. He looks like he is on the brink of fainting. Before things got worse, he finishes in a whisper. Legolas reaches over and puts a hand on his shoulder. Gimli flinches under the touch, but does not shake him off.
Your father resisted turning for a whole week after a bite?
Legolas confirms gently. Gimli manages a nod. Legolas looks back at the others.
None of the Bjornings lasted more than a few hours after being bit, he says. They became feverish and then chilled and then died. In 10, perhaps 30 minutes after death, a little longer in some cases, but never more than an hour or two, they would rise again, dead and hungry.
Gimli looks up, frowning. My Da never died, he snaps.
He must have,
Legolas says. He draws his hand back, but his strange voice remains gentle.
He was not breathing when I shot him.
Boromir jerks in his chair hard enough to make its legs scrape against the floor. No one spends the time or effort to hush him. He never died, Gimli repeated insistently. I would have noticed if he'd suddenly fallen over. Perhaps he did not fall, one of the dwarven doctors says slowly. You were walking the path down from the auxiliary parking area when your father succumbed to the disease, were you not? At Gimli's nod, the doctor continues. From the description of events you have given us, my best guess as to what happened is that your father passed into a sort of fugue state during the walk, stubbornly continuing to walk long after his body should have given up. We are a stubborn people, after all, he adds, his beard curving up for a moment in a self-deprecating smile. Gimli does not smile back, but he does nod. Well, Glóin's hard-headedness may have been enough to keep him on his legs, the dwarven doctor continues. But no amount of willpower can hold off a disease, so at some point his body simply gave out. Probably a cardiac event, based on what the autopsy showed, although admittedly the results were inconclusive. This disease does some very strange things to a body, and it skewed all of our results on...
Perhaps noticing the look of distress on Gimli's face, or perhaps sensing the sharp stares from the rest of the room, the doctor clears his throat and says hurriedly,
"Well, at any rate, you would hardly have noticed if you were not looking, and perhaps not even if you were."
He shrugs.
"And perhaps dwarves succumb differently than the humans that Legolas observed. Perhaps the transition between living and death is smoother in our people, or perhaps it was because he managed to resist the turning for so much longer, and that gave the disease more time to replicate through his system before he finally succumbed. From the viral levels we detected afterwards, Glóin would have been nearly dead already by the time you started down the path, the virus almost fully in control by then. And once he died, the ravenous and obsessive hunger that Legolas has described for us would have caused his body to pursue the nearest living thing, namely you."
The dwarven doctor shakes his head, his lined face heavy with sorrow.
"One moment, he was your father, following you into the valley. The next, he was only a dead thing wearing your father's face."
He pauses for a moment, and then adds,
"I am sorry for your loss, lad. We all are."
Gimli nods again, but he does not raise his face. Boromir suspects that he is weeping into his beard, and he turns his own eyes away to give Gimli as much privacy in his grief as this crowded conference room can offer. Wait! Isterin sits forward suddenly, her brown eyes gleaming. Gimli recovered? All around the table, heads turn to stare at her. Isterin's cheeks are too dark for Boromir to see a blush burn across them, but from the way she draws back into her chair, he suspects that she is blushing nonetheless. I mean, he is not an elf, but he recovered. He was not bitten. Legolas interrupts, his voice apologetic. He was exposed to infected blood, quite a lot of it, and I am sorry for that, Legolas adds quietly, leaning sideways to speak to Gimli. The words have the sound of long repetition. I should have been faster to see what was happening and to understand and act. I am sorry. I did not expect to find any of the dead on this side of the Misty Mountains yet, but still I ought... Legolas, Elrond says, his voice kind but sharp. You were saying... The Mirkwood elf straightens quickly in his chair. Yes, he says. I apologize, Nestando Elrond. I was saying that Gimli was not bit, but rather exposed to the blood of the dead. I believe he even swallowed some, but thankfully your healers forced him to purge himself of that before it could infect him. But he was not bit.
The infection vector makes that much of a difference? One of the elven healers asks. Legolas shrugs.
It did to the Bjornings. Those who were bit turned, without exception. Those who ingested the blood of the dead almost all turned, but some of those who managed to spit or vomit immediately did not.
Why would anyone ingest the blood? Asks one of the university scholars in a wondering voice. Battle, Boromir suggests, the word jerked from his mouth almost involuntarily. At Legolas's confirming nod, he goes on. Sometimes when you are fighting, and what you are fighting is bleeding, you cannot help but get its blood on you. Sometimes you get it in your eyes, your mouth. It is not, he says with a pointed look at the soft scholar, something that one does on purpose, but in battle things happen that one does not always intend.
Yes,
says Legolas, as the scholar draws back into his chair with an apologetic nod.
And the Bjornings who got too much blood on them, or did not wash it off soon enough, often turned too, although more slowly than they did when they were bit.
And elves do not turn from exposure to infected blood? Glorfindel asks.
No, says Legolas. At least, not that I know of. Although
his face twists up in some unspoken pain, and he ducks his head for a moment, speaking quietly through the curtain of his hair.
Although the combination of wounds and blood and bites can be fatal to us, too, if there is enough.
He glances at Gimli, and then away again quickly before saying,
I do not know how well dwarves can resist such exposure, but I do know that no human who experienced what Gimli did would be alive right now.
For a moment, his words are followed by silence. Then, suddenly, the whole room seems to erupt in noise and motion. The doctors shoot to their feet all around the table, all of them seeming to speak at once. The university folks are only a few seconds behind them. Get the human staff out of the quarantine ward. Check everyone for bites as they leave. Swab noses for traces of bleeding. Cannot risk this spreading further. We'll need to alert the whole valley to the nature of this threat, but without engendering panic. Some sort of statement for the public, something structured to maintain calm. But without mitigating the severity of the issue, yes. Alas, that Elendil is not available. He has always had a knack for calming.
Aragorn will not like being told to abandon his patients.
I don't care. He is still a human. He's vulnerable. Get him out of there. We need to. And mandate treatment by elves and dwarven Aristar only for any patient believed to be showing signs of this infection. Make sure the protocol is very clear. Word to Gildor immediately. Tell him to be on guard for infection among the patients at the Haven. Not just Gildor. We have to warn everyone. The Shire, Bree, Buckland, Moria, too, if they don't already know. If this is in the water... With the Palantir relays down, we'll have to send messengers to carry the news in person. We cannot wait on a technical... We'll need to ensure we have at least one elven Verandor scheduled with every emergency team henceforward.
only elves as messengers, or traveling in company with at least one elf anyway. We don't want anyone drinking infected water unknowingly. And if dwarves cannot detect the contamination, then it is unlikely that humans...
What about Lothlorien? If we can't get through to them via the P-network?
Need to run tests on the families of all current patients, and test their drinking water as well, if the valley's water is already compromised. Could be facing a tragedy the likes of which we have not seen since Sauron fell, unless...
Boromir sits back in his chair, overwhelmed. It is not just the tumult of activity around him, but the constrained chaos combined with the weight of all he has just learned is more than he is prepared to deal with immediately. No one seems to be paying him any attention, at least. No one needs him for anything right now. He can simply sit here and let his head spin until it settles. After a moment, he notices that there are two others in the room who are also not racing for intercoms or shouting instructions or scribbling notes or rushing off upon their duties. Legolas, the elf of Mirkwood who first saw the dead, and Gimli, whose father was recently numbered among said rekindled corpses before being sent to his final grave by none other than Legolas himself. That's certainly one way to make an introduction, and an impression, Boromir thinks with grim gallows humor. By contrast, his turning to the dwarf in the chair beside him and extending his hand must surely be almost anticlimactic in its normalcy.
Boromir Stewardson, I am sorry for your loss. Gimli Boranul, the dwarf says gruffly. Thank you.
Boromir has never known any dwarves well. They come to Minas Tirith sometimes, because any city that is made almost entirely from stone is a place that is going to offer lucrative economic opportunities to dwarven craftsmen. But they tend to socialize mostly among their own kind, or with those few human builders who have earned enough respect to be worth their time, not with Gondor's soldiers. But he has always had respect for them. They are a sensible, forthright people who have a reputation for keeping their word unbroken and their beards out of trouble. It is a surprise every time, the way their broad hands swallow his up in a handshake. Boromir is not a small man, and being made to feel small by someone who is almost 2 feet shorter than him is unsettling. The dwarf takes his hand back while Boromir is still blinking at the width of Gimli's palm. He covers his momentary distraction with a smile and reaches past Gimli to offer his hand to the elf, perching, technically, on the chair on the other side of him.
And you are Legolas,
he says, waiting for the elf to provide the rest of his name. He does not.
Yes,
Legolas says, with a bobbing nod of his head. He blinks, tilts his head sideways in contemplation, as though trying to remember what to do with a mortal's hand, then abruptly leans forward. Boromir manages not to wince at the sight of the spindly-limbed elf teetering on the edge of his seat in a way that would have put any other being on the floor face first, and folds his fingers around Boromir's. The handshake with the elf is even stranger than the one with the dwarf. Legolas's hand is much thinner than Boromir's, but so long that it feels as though he must have an entire extra knuckle on each finger.
His hand is dry and smooth, and the clasp of those cool fingers against Boromir's skin feels like nothing so much as shaking hands with the branches of some skinny tree. Boromir is grateful that the disquieting handshake does not last long, although he musters another smile as he pulls his hand back against the arm of his chair, curling the fingers around the carved wood to keep himself from wiping his palm instinctively against the leg of his jeans. His hand does not feel unclean in any way, but his instincts tell him that he has just touched a plant of some sort, and by consequence must surely have some dirt now clinging to his skin. Legolas does not seem to notice, although his pale gaze is fixed very intently on Boromir's face.
"Have you ever seen the dead marshes?"
Legolas asks abruptly. Boromir starts. It is not the most pressing question he thought he was likely to be asked by either of them.
"Yes," he says. "Yes, I have been assigned to the patrols through Ithilien many times."
It is his turn to tilt his head curiously at the elf.
"Have you?" he asks, remembering Legolas's words about his own long-dead grandfather coming out of those waters to bring death to their forest.
"No," says Legolas. "No, I have never left Mirkwood before. Well, not beyond the occasional visit to the markets of Dale, at least. I am not sure whether or not that counts as leaving when it is only a short walk to spend a few hours beyond the borders of our trees."
Boromir cannot help but stare. To have spent one's entire life in the murder forest of all those jokes and memes and weird impossible stories that circulate through the edges of the P network.
"They rarely do leave their trees," Gimli assures him. "The elves of Mirkwood. My own home, the Lonely Mountain, isn't far from the borders of their woods. We see more of their kind than anyone, save perhaps the Delmen, for we frequent those markets as well. And yet I have seen fewer than 24 Mirkwood elves in my entire life."
Boromir thinks that he ought to say something. He settles for attempting a sympathetic smile and saying,
"I am not overly fond of traveling far from home myself."
That seems to work, for Legolas offers him a smile of his own. His smooth, narrow face is difficult to read, and Boromir cannot say whether the expression is grateful, commiserating, or merely polite. Nonetheless, it is a smile, and so he will count the interaction as a successful one.
"I would not have come were it not so important that the world be warned of the dangers of the dead," Legolas says. "Especially not with my home, my people, in such danger."
Gimli frowns.
"But you said the elves cannot be easily infected."
"We are not," Legolas says, "but we can be killed."
"Killed?" Boromir repeats.
"By the dead? But—"
Legolas tilts his head and blinks at them both. Perched as he is on the edge of his chair, with his knees up still, it makes him look like an oversized bird.
"What did you think I meant when I said the dead seek to feed upon us?"
he says, and Boromir feels his stomach lurch as though he has just swallowed a half-frozen bottle of fizz pop in a single gulp.
I did not realize that the dead were so dangerous, he admits. They are, says Gimli, and his voice is bleak. Boromir resolves to find someone he can ask for the full details of Gimli's father's death. He does not want to ask it now, and force pain upon the dwarf by making him relate the story himself. But he has a feeling that this is something that will be important for him to know. Legolas nods his own grim agreement with the dwarf's words.
The dead are slower and clumsier than they were in life,
he explains quietly,
but they do not feel pain, and they are not deterred by injury. The only way to stop them, to kill them again, is to damage or remove the head so that the thoughts that move them can no longer do so.
Are they still themselves, or not? Boromir asks. I thought you said they were not.
They do not seem to remember anything of their living selves, no,
Legolas says with a short, tight shake of his head.
The dead evince no recognition, even of ones they once loved dearly, nor do they speak or show any signs of understanding words spoken in turn to them. They demonstrate very little ability to reason, nor indeed even to grasp simple concepts of cause and effect. They know enough of their own surroundings to not readily step off the edge of an overhanging bank or into an obvious pit, but not enough to easily realize the dangers of walking through fire or water, and as they do not breathe, the latter can only hurt them if the current is swift enough to carry them off their feet and into some other danger. All that they are,
the elf says, his voice low and his eyes gleaming like hollow stars,
is hunger and need and an insatiable fixation upon the flesh of the living. The dead do not stop, not even if going on means their own destruction. They will not stop, cannot be stopped by anything short of a second final death. Their spirits are gone, their eyes empty. They are nothing but dead husks, desperate for something to fill the hollow where their souls should be. Nothing but hungry teeth and clawing hands, and an incessant starving moan shambling through the forests of our trees, willing to eat the world if that is what it takes to sate their hunger, and, Legolas whispers, I fear even that would not be enough for them. They are empty, and they cannot be filled.
Boromir stares at the elf, only realizing that he himself has stopped breathing when the ache of his lungs forces him to draw in a breath so shaken and raw that he nearly chokes on it. And this is what awaits my people? Gimli asks. Everyone who was sick when I left, and everyone who has fallen ill since then? He is turned away from Boromir, likewise facing Legolas, and so Boromir cannot see his face. From the sound of horror in his voice, he thinks he can picture the expression beneath Gimli's beard, however. He thinks it must look very like his own.
Yes, Legolas says softly, I fear so.
Gimli lifts his hands and hides his face in the shelter of his palms. Legolas watches him for a few seconds, his strange elvish face drawn in an expression of concern. Then his eyes flick up suddenly to fix on Boromir's instead.
"And what of Gondor?"
he asks softly.
"Your white city lies close to the dead marshes."
"Gondor is fine," Boromir answers with a confidence that he does not feel. "It is my countrymen who have held the darkness back from the rest of Middle-earth for so long, and our walls are high and strong. I do not fear that my city will succumb to death now."
Legolas smiles at him, but it does not reach his eyes.
"I hope you are right,"
he says. Boromir scoffs, certain that he is. And yet, as he looks at Gimli's head bowed with grief and worry, he nonetheless cannot help but feel a thread of fear. The Anduin runs so close to Minas Tirith after all. It is Gimli who distracts him from his fear, ironically enough. The dwarf lifts his head to squint up at Boromir through red-rimmed eyes, and says, "So there is no plague in Gondor, then?" When Boromir shakes his head, almost feeling as though he ought to apologize given the grief that Gimli and his people have suffered, the dwarf's frown deepens. "So what brought you on the long journey to Rivendell?" he asks. "Was it only to tell these scholars about the disappearance of the echoes of long-dead bodies from your marshes?" He does not say that seems a message that could have waited for the Palantir network to be repaired. He does not need to. Boromir can hear the censure in his voice, and flinches, for he made that same argument himself. But he also agreed to come, in the end, because Gondor needed him, so he will not speak ill of the decision that led him here now. "It is not our marsh," Boromir says stiffly, "but Mordor's. And that is the heart of the concern that brought me here. The sudden absence of the bodies, corporeal or not, that have lain there for so many years would have been worrisome in any context. That many of those bodies were left behind by wars of Sauron, and that the dead marshes themselves lie on the poisoned outskirts of what were once his lands, made it doubly so. We searched for weeks to determine the fate of those vanished corpses, or to espy evidence of whatever plot caused their removal. We could find nothing, which we took for a sure sign that the Witch King of Mordor was up to some foul scheme." His eyes narrow as he looks at this dwarf and elf, whose lands enjoy idle contentment thanks only to Gondor's incessant vigilance. Vigilance which the rest of Middle-earth is all too quick and far too happy to dismiss as paranoid warmongering. "We thought," Boromir says coldly, "that perhaps the rest of Middle-earth might offer us some support in our struggle to keep the threat of Mordor locked behind its gates for once, even if it was no more than an explanation for the baffling disappearance of these ancient bodies. Some of the legislature," he continues, "even entertained the thought that a few of our erstwhile allies might even be willing to send forces of their own to join us in defense against whatever this new evil was. But for myself, I have learned not to expect any concrete help from this side of the Misty Mountains. I came only in hope of answers, and would have been content with that."
"You have your answers now," Legolas says softly. for whatever comfort they might bring.
Do I? Boromir retorts. It seems that we still do not know what spurred these dead to suddenly abandon their watery graves and start attacking the living, nor what goal the Witch King might have in mind for sending them out to feed upon your people. If it is the Witch King's doing at all, Gimli points out in an irritatingly reasonable tone. It reminds Boromir of his brother, and he scowls at the dwarf. Who else could be, would be, behind such a thing? Gimli shrugs. I don't know, he admits. But I don't know what good this would do the Witch King either. Were the armies of Mordor not broken long ago, the lands laid waste? They are a vanquished nation, populated by wraiths and resentment, and little else. You have not lived on Mordor's borders, Boromir snaps back. He has been told before that Gondor jumps at shadows. He likes hearing that censure no more now than he did then, for all that Gimli has not spoken it outright. You do not know that land. I do not, Gimli admits. But neither of us know the cause of the rising of these dead. Best not leap to conclusions without more evidence, lest in doing so we blind ourselves to the truth. I know all the truth I need to, Boromir retorts. Perhaps if your people were not so blind to the threat of Mordor, against which Gondor and Gondor alone has stood vigilant these last 3,000 years, they would not be suffering as they are.
Mordor is not the only place in Middle-earth where dangers can be found,
Legolas says, and the rustle of his low whisper is cold enough to quench the blaze of Boromir's temper.
And as you say, it is not Gondor that is now besieged by death and sickness.
You are right, Boromir says. I apologize. My temper is short, but that does not excuse my taking it out on you. I think all our tempers are short right now, Gimli says bleakly, and we do not have time to indulge ourselves in taking offense over small slights. Your words are forgotten.
Boromir smiles his thanks, but he cannot help thinking that Gimli is right, that they are all running short on time these days. Even his own stalwart, dauntless Gondor. Up next, won't someone think of the children?